Hello and welcome to the second episode of this very amazing journey that we have coined and dubbed Zuula. Now Zuula translates to discover. My name is Shadrach Kisame and we're going to be having a good time as we go back in time. We take a deep dive in the economic history of the country. Now it's important to understand that the economy of our motherland, Uganda, was present, was alive, was kicking even before colonialism. Now before we answer the first question, it's actually important and imperative that we investigate the economy of the country before colonialism. Now to some, when we talk about colonialism, it's just thinking about white European men chasing Africans with spears, but it goes much more than that, because colonialism actually affected our economics. Colonialism actually affected our way of life. Now before colonialism, the economy of the country was involved in trade, and this trade, there was long distance trade where we had people moving long journeys from back and forth outside the country coming here to trade. That involved long distance trade. It involved also slave trade, the nightmare that took Africa by storm. Till date, we're still suffering from these effects. Who was doing this slave trade? Arabs from North Africa. They would come here, ferry Ugandans, yes, local Ugandans, back to North Africa, overseas for money. It was partly barter trade, so there was economics moving on. But you'd give me your cow and I would give you a mirror. You'd give me land and I would actually give you grains. So that was economics right there, but it was barter trade. If it was to come now, I would give you my suit and you actually give me a phone. But that's actually what happened. Later, we saw the introduction of cowrie shells. Now these Ugandan tribes were involved in pre-capitalist mode of economics. They were involved in activities like livestock, fisheries, but this was actually predominantly for home consumption, what you would call for food. Most Ugandans then would grow food, would do whatever they do just for their stomach. There was no economic activity at all. All I needed was to feed my family. Was life good back then? Get back to me in the comment section. Now it was not only limited to fisheries or farming. We had Ugandans and people of these tribes actually involving themselves in artisanship and professional skills like blacksmith, carpentry. Some of you might think that carpentry of the chairs or the furniture that you have in your house started today. Our forefathers were carpenters, they were blacksmiths. So all these chains that you have, everything that you have that is of metal existed way back then. And they're also involved in medical hubs. Now doctors have not come today. We had black herbalists who intensively studied herbs to get cure for people way back. Now water transport is just to mention but a few. Water transport has not started today with submarines, ships, and name it. All you needed back then was to get your wood, carve something, and just float on water. Now during the Industrial Revolution, it's important to note that Uganda became a place of interest for the Europeans. This was following reports that they got from missionaries. Now the discussion of whether missionaries came here to actually preach the gospel or do some other thing is a discussion for another day. But we have it on authoritative ground that the missionaries are the ones that gave reports to then colonialists who later came and made Uganda a protectorate. In 1886, Britain and Germany sat down on a round table and signed the treaty. Guess what? The treaty was to divide East Africa. We would see Germany take Tanganyika, now Tanzania, and Britain take Uganda and Kenya. As our ancestors were busy farming and hunting, the white man was on a round table devising means of taking their land. Eventually, Britain was busy taking part and minding business in its other colonies like South Africa. Now this took so much of its attention and resources, hence being reluctant with Uganda. Consequently, Britain all of a sudden discovered that they had an administration burden. Guess what? They decided to go the commercial way. Hence the introduction of the Imperial British East African Company, IBECO. We see Sir William Mackinnon becoming the first administrator of the IBECO and handling things for IBECO here in Uganda on behalf of the East African colony. In 1894, due to the conflicts among the various factions that were in Uganda by then, the Kabaka, the Protestants, the Catholics, the Muslims, and the company itself, IBECO failed to handle matters in Uganda. This brought back the attention of the British government. They dissolved IBECO, and guess what? They declared Uganda a British protectorate. Now, as the saying goes, that not all glitters is gold, as Britain had declared Uganda a British protectorate, there were strong and sound, powerful leaders in Uganda from kingdoms like Buganda with Kabaka Mwanga. We saw the Omukama of Bunyoro, Kabalega, rise up against them. This did not leave the colonial masters in peace. Kabaka Mwanga of Buganda and Omukama Kabalega of Bunyoro were forced into exile into the Seychelles Islands. They lost their leadership over their kingdoms and they eventually died. In Buganda Kingdom, Kabaka Mwanga was replaced by his son Daudi Chwa at a tender age, which made it necessary for the king regents to help in the decision making of the issues of the kingdom. In order to protect and safeguard their imperialist interests in Uganda, solve land and boundary problems between Buganda and their neighbors, to find an acceptable way of assisting the young king of Buganda, Daudi Chwa II, the British signed an agreement with Buganda on 10th March 1900. Now, this is the famous 1900 Buganda Agreement that has effects until date. The British government was represented by Governor Sir Henry Hamilton Johnson, and Buganda was represented by the three regents, Sir Apollo Kagwa, Stanislaus Mugwanya, Zakaria Kizito Kisinjiri. Now, most of us have illusions, most of us have ideas of the 1900 Buganda Agreement, as famous as it is, but a lot is entailed in this agreement. Now, after the 1900 Buganda Agreement, Buganda Kingdom stood out in the whole of Uganda to the effect that she became a state within a state, something that earned hatred from the people of other regions. Now, this is where jealousy or competition from these different regions or kingdoms starts. It doesn't start now where people are competing with each other in our day. It starts from way back at the signing of the Buganda Agreement, because then this made Buganda a country of its own, yet it was in Uganda. After the 1900 agreement, Buganda Kingdom stood out in the whole of Uganda to the effect that she became a state within a state, something that earned it hatred from the people of other regions. He lost power over land distribution since he could not give it out as he wanted, as the case was before. Remember, the Kabaka back then would give out land to whoever he pleases because he was the king. This meant that he lost his royalty. Now, it's the Kabaka's right to give out land to whoever he pleases, to whoever has pleased him. He lost control over his chiefs, who became public servants paid by the protectorate government. Now, it's important to understand that the person that has money is the one that rules. He was also reduced to an employee of the British, earning a monthly salary. You can imagine the Kabaka earning a salary. He lost his military powers since he could not raise an army without the consent of the protectorate government. Now, it's also important to note that before the British came, the Kabaka had his own local army called the Batabazi. These ones were mandated to keep the king and his subjects safe. The agreement led to the introduction of tax of 3 rupees, which meant that Buganda had to grow cash crops to raise money to pay this tax, hence the commercialization of agriculture. Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Comments in the section below. In order to effectively control and run the economy, the British formed a company called the Uganda Company Limited. Now, you can imagine there was a company that owned our country. Did you know that Uganda was actually owned by a company? Furthermore, the 1900 Buganda Agreement laid the foundation for the signing of a similar agreement with other kingdoms, for example, the Toro Kingdom in June 1900, Ankole in August 1901, and Bunyoro in 1903, before the testimonies that Uganda had submitted to the British rule. Furthermore, the 1900 Buganda Agreement laid the foundation for the signing of similar agreements with other kingdoms, for example, Toro in June 1900, Ankole in August 1901, and Bunyoro in 1903. This implied that Uganda had submitted to the British rule. When British colonialism was formalized by the signing of these 4 agreements with the major kingdoms in Uganda, they used its economic potentials to supply raw materials to their factories in Britain. In other words, Uganda's economy was an enclave economy. an economy characterized by having small islands of pseudo-modernity, producing raw materials and surrounded by a sea of pre-capitalist backwardness. This small island of pseudo-modernity was comprised of the 3 C's: coffee, cotton, and copper, and the 3 T's: tea, tobacco, and tourism. Coffee was not roasted locally at all. Some of the little cotton was used by Nightingale Textiles, which had been a reform by Sir Andrew Cohen, but the rest was exported raw. Now, it's expedient to note that during this time, Indians had become prosperous and dominated much of the Ugandan economy, with some acting in the role of colonial overseers for the British regime. They were also the administrators of the Uganda Development Corporation, an umbrella of 88 companies which had replaced the Uganda Company Limited on behalf of the British. The UDC was in charge of all cash crops that were grown by both Africans and foreigners. Now, it's important to note that around that time, Britain was looking for money to fund the Second World War. Now, this saw them liquidating all the assets that they had to the Indians who were present at that time. We saw the formation of the UDC, the Uganda Development Corporation. After that, the Indians now take over the Ugandan economy. All that in the 3rd episode. Do not go away. I'm coming back.